Hello, Stephanie.
Hi.
We have got a guest on today that we have been meaning to have on for a while. Been trying to get her on because she creates some brilliant content and one of the few content creators that are talking about disordered eating recovery through the autistic lens.
Yes. I call her Liv, but officially her name is Livia, but her handle on Instagram is LivLabelFree and her website is
Live
attached.
label
It
is
is.
livelabelfree.com.
So,
Yeah.
without further ado, here is our conversation with Livia Sara.
We're not good at starting,
Yep, we are
just so you
pretty
know.
I
terrible.
know. I listened to your
Oh,
podcast,
yeah.
but that's why I love it. And also at the end, it's like, okay, are we gonna stop now? Sarah, Steph, are you gonna edit it? It's just funny.
In order to best serve all our needs, why don't you can introduce yourself and also introduce the book that you've just written that we're here to talk a little bit about, among other things.
Okay, so my name is Livia, but a lot of people call me Liv, and it's kind of actually a funny backstory how the Liv came to be. So the whole Instagram started a long time ago, and I wanted to just like remain anonymous. I didn't want anyone to know who I was, and no one knew me as Liv. So like my usernames evolved as like Simply Balanced Liv Recovering Foodie, whatever, whatever. And then over time, people just started calling me Liv when it eventually evolved into Live Label Free. And even my family calls me that now, which I love. I like to call myself a neurodivergent eating disorder recovery coach. So specifically, helping people find food freedom and find their unique way of eating in a way that supports their mind and body from a neurodiversity affirming perspective, because a lot of the traditional models to help people recover from disordered eating and help them make peace with food, it doesn't often work for people who have different brains and differently wired nervous systems and all that. So that's what I do, and I love writing. I think that is my greatest passion, and that's something that I discovered in my own recovery, that there was all this energy growing up as a child, that just all this built up fight or flight energy that I didn't know what to do with. There was no way for me to shake it out of my body. And I think initially that manifested into my eating disorder. And I like to say my autism manifested as an eating disorder. And I think that's why so many treatment professionals, weren't able to help me in the right way, because they saw a thin, white, privileged female. Oh, anorexia. Oh, she wants to lose weight. Oh, she thinks she's fat. And none of that ever applied to me. It was all rooted in, the autistic traits, which I'm sure we can get into in a bit. And when I ultimately discovered I'm autistic, it was like, wow, like this explains everything.
When and how did you realize that you were autistic?
Yeah, so that was in 2020. And by this point, I'd say I was quote unquote recovered from my eating disorder, as far to the extent that I thought one could be recovered, for about 2 years. And this is when I started Live Label Free coaching just for eating disorders. I didn't even know about, like, I knew about autism, but I was like, autism is a little boy who loves trains and doesn't talk. The stereotype, because we aren't taught in school, what is autism. And my very first client, this was actually a beautiful story, and I read about it in my first book, Rainbow Girl, how my very first client was autistic. And by this time, I already had my website, livelabelfree.com, and I was writing my blogs, and I was already sharing a lot of my story online. And it was, I talked about being labeled as too complex and manipulative and treatment resistant and all the things that many autistic people are labeled as when they go to traditional treatment. And this girl was telling me, I'm autistic and I really resonate with your story about being thrown out of the treatment system because no one understood you, no one believed you. You were constantly being invalidated. And as she was telling me about her life and her characteristics, and even just this like unspoken energy exchange I was having with her, I was like, okay, this whole autism thing, I need to check this out. I need to look into this. And my mom had all these books about eating disorders and how to help your teen beat an eating disorder, all the self-help books that the desperate parents buy. And she had this one book in her shelf called Asperger's, about, how autism presents in females. And she hadn't read any of these books, because I think she started and was like, what is this? Like, Livia should just be doing the therapy and whatever. But I started reading that book, and I've never read a book so fast in my entire life. And it was that at that moment that I knew, this is me. Although the puzzle piece is very controversial in the space for valid reasons, I felt like this autism piece was the piece that completed this like puzzle of not only like the past eating disorder that I still couldn't understand because I thought it was like caused by trauma or the therapist said it like you have a deep dark hole in your past that you need to figure out before you recover. But I never resonated with that because I was like, I would think and think there's like, yeah, like I felt lonely growing up, and in a sense I think growing up undiagnosed autistic can be traumatic for the nervous system in a lot of ways. But I mean, I was never abused or anything like that. So I just couldn't figure it out. And then the autism piece just really made it so crystal clear to me. And because I then started, really focusing on bridging that gap, that's kind of how I really found this purpose that I'm living now. Is like there is such a different presentation of eating disorders, and I actually like to call them eating adaptations when it comes to neurodivergence and autism and ADHD and all the things that I really realized I have a gift for explaining it and for helping people find freedom in their own unique way. So
Can
I
I stop you
hope
for
that
one
answers
second?
your question. Yeah.
It does. And I just want to speak to anyone listening who doesn't have any prior knowledge or background to like what this actually means. So when you were reading that book, did you say it was Asperger's?
Yeah,
We
because
can link that.
Asperger's used to
Yeah.
be a quote unquote high functioning autism
Mm,
diagnosis, but now that diagnosis doesn't exist anymore. Now it just all falls under autism spectrum disorder.
right. What are the things that you were resonating with? And then how, when you were speaking earlier about how traditional treatment misses this, like there's not an
Yeah.
alignment between the way that eating disorders in a neurotypical person might, are presenting and how that like falling under that umbrella of diagnosis or treatment is harmful. Like, can you bring that all together? Like, what are the distinctions here?
I'm actually really excited by this question because I think it was a few weeks ago, Sarah asked me to explain some quote unquote ED behaviors that are actually autistic traits. There are so many that I can go down, but like the first ones that come to mind are like this intense need for predictability. Growing up, I always wanted to know everything in advance. My mom always jokes how whenever we went anywhere, like a party or a potluck or something, the first thing I would ask the moment we got there is, okay, mom, exactly what time are we leaving? And she would never understand it. But now looking back, it's like I just needed to know exactly what was going to happen. And I ate the same thing growing up, always the same foods. I talk about this a lot in my memoir. My parents encouraged me, to eat other things. And it wasn't necessarily that I was a picky eater. It was just I needed to know exactly what I was going to get. I needed to know what I was going to expect. School was very, very hard for me because, unpredictability. So in eating disorder treatment, when we would go on like restaurant outing, which was every Friday, I remember, we weren't allowed to know, where we were going until the moment we got there. And that would just fill me with anxiety. And they would say, that's your eating disorder. Who wants to plan the healthiest option? That's your eating disorder this, that's your eating disorder that. So also when it came to numbers, calorie counting, weighing food, I was never one to weigh myself, ironically enough, not as obsessively as I did with my food scale, but attaching food and eating for neurodivergent people can be such an abstract concept because we are so, logical. Everything is approached almost algorithmically. Everything is structured. And this concept of even, especially intuitive eating, just listening to your body, that can feel like so far off, almost like in this intergalactic void. That's what we can experience intuitive eating as. And then, in a sense, the counting, the weighing food, the adding up calories, tracking steps can almost be a way for us to feel grounded on this planet, to turn something vague and abstract into something that we can feel and touch and see. And for me, as someone who's a very existentialist thinker, asking, where did we come from? What's the meaning of life? I can now so clearly see how, all this stuff, trying to make everything tangible, trying to make everything, very clear right here, makes a lot of sense from that perspective. But then, of course, the professionals say, oh, you're counting calories because you want to restrict, you're weighing food because you want to eat less. But this is, where I like flip it around, and especially in my work with clients is, what if we actually used these traits to help you eat more, to help you, make peace with having higher numbers? And that was a really key aspect of my own recovery is, when I left treatment the day I was released, I secretly bought a food scale because that was the only way that I could, eat enough outside of treatment. And I didn't tell anyone that. The first time I admitted that was actually in my book. Those are just two examples of how treatment really doesn't understand that these surface level eating disorder behaviors that can be coming from a very different place for a lot of neurotypical people are actually just rooted in this deep need for certainty and trust in this world that is just so abstract and really no one can comprehend.
Mm.
So where you are now in your recovered state, do you think that your recovery might look different to a neurotypical's recovery? Like, what does recovery look like for you? Because I'm guessing if some of these traits that were originally labeled as ED traits are actually autistic traits, it's like, well, actually, I still have these traits, but I know
Yes.
they're part of my autism, and I'm still in a healthy mental and physical place with food.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I would say going back to that like predictability and menu aspect, and I know that Sarah, you talked about this in your absolutely wonderful interview with Carly about how if I'm going out to eat anywhere, I can't just go and just see what's there when I get there. I will look up the menu, look up pictures of the venue. Hey, that rhymed. I need to know exactly what I'm gonna get. Also, because sometimes, and this really pisses me off when restaurants do this, is when they have something on the menu, and they like explain what it is, but then they bring it to you, and there's like parsley or stuff on it that they didn't say was going to be on it. And so I will like look up pictures of the dish on like Google Photos and stuff. But I just need to know exactly what I'm going to get. And that has nothing to do with, oh, I want to restrict. It just has to do with I need to know. And that's kind of the same with the food scale. I often joke with my clients, if I had a camera installed in my kitchen and my past therapist would like look at me, they'd think I have an eating disorder. Because sometimes, especially when I am really stressed out and I'm really anxious and my whole body almost feels like it's two separate. My being feels like it's separate from my body and it's so hard to tap into that intuitive piece. I will weigh my food just to like know like, okay, this is what I always have, I know this is enough, so I can eat it without this abstract doubt and questioning of how much should I eat right now, like I don't know if this is good, and just that back and forth that just is absolutely paralyzing. I think another thing that I have that again in treatment, looking back, I'm like, this was so harmful, how we weren't allowed to move or walk around, or we always had to be sitting. Always had to be sitting because standing up was quote unquote trying to burn calories. I am someone who needs a lot of movement to regulate myself. I was actually born bicycle kicking my legs in the air. We have a picture of me lying on the scale, ironically, in the hospital, bicycle kicking my legs in the air. And as a kid, I was always getting up and running around and climbing on things that I wasn't allowed to climb on. And I think that's, I was an athlete growing up too. Like I played all these different sports, and I mean, I was never tired. Like I was always running around and doing stuff. And even now, I need to walk. I need to ride my bicycle. If I don't, I just feel like trapped in my own body. And I think again, that was another thing that I do now, that I walk around a lot. When I'm on phone calls, I will pace around. As I'm doing this interview, I'm standing up. Otherwise, I can't speak coherently. That's another thing, that I have that I can now recognize. This has nothing to do with calories or restriction because although I may move more than the average person, I probably also eat more to compensate for that. And I think when the intention behind the behavior is rooted in understanding and compassion for oneself rather than fear of what if worst case scenario happens? What if I gain weight? What if XYZ? That's how you can inherently distinguish this eating disorder behavior from an autistic traits. And There are so many more I could go into, but I'm going to stop myself there because I don't want it to take up the entire interview.
Well, you're here for the interview, but it's
I know.
interesting the element of shame, right? Like that in order to have deconstructed all of this, there's so much implicit shame that might have come from you're doing this because this, you're doing this because
Yeah,
this, what you're doing is wrong. You can't do that. You can't be recovered from an eating disorder and still be weighing your food. And
right.
in order to deconstruct that, it's like the self-compassion of understanding oneself and trusting that, like, no, the reasons that this is happening, the motivations behind it are different for me. And
Hmm.
being able to separate that from the voices, the mainstream of
Yeah.
this is because of this is why you're doing something, and how much that process, I have to imagine, took a while to kind of like be like, wait, these messages I've been receiving and absorbing as I'm doing something wrong, questioning and like pulling that apart is part of another ask in recovery with neurodivergence.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of untangling like the right wrong piece. I think also for me, and here's why I kind of bring in that existentialism piece, because I've learned that neurodivergent people, specifically autistic people, we are very existentialist thinkers, thinking, why are we here? What's the meaning of life? That quote that I told you before we started recording, the human condition is suffering accepted, but it's about finding something worth suffering for. I think for me, in a lot of ways, this eating disorder, which it was diagnosed as anorexia, but I think I resonated a lot more with orthorexia and being like the perfect healthy eater almost. That gave me such a deep sense of purpose in my life. And I felt, growing up, I felt so different from everyone else. I didn't know what it was, but I knew like what's going on in their heads is not the same as what's going on in my head. Because I also, always would communicate a lot better with like adults, like with my parents' friends, and I would talk to them and have conversations about their kids, and they would always think that was so interesting. I was never playing with their kids, but I just wanted to talk about, yeah, so the homework assignment is this, and we're learning about this. And I think it's really interesting how XYZ, and I was clearly different than a lot of other people. And for me, because I couldn't label it at the time, but I knew it was different. I was like, I need something that can make me right in this world where I just feel like I'm wrong. And this purpose of, being this quote unquote perfect healthy eater, it was like, as long as I do this perfectly, I will be right. I will be on the right path. And I think when someone is recovering from an eating disorder, neurodivergent or not, it is really disentangling that right wrong piece, because I think the entire eating disorder and diet culture has a huge impact on this. It conditions us that there is a right way to eat, there is a right way to move, there's a wrong weight to be, there's a wrong amount of calories to eat. I mean, it's so incredibly harmful. I don't need to tell you guys that or anyone listening to that, because after all, this is life after diet. But I think, yeah, for me specifically, when it came to autism, and those quote unquote ED behaviors that are actually autistic traits, I really had to work on shifting that narrative to these desires, these needs, these wants are not wrong. They're also not right. They're me. And I think that's kind of where the live label free comes into all of this, is that I believe that, when we can live in peace, that's when we can live a life of neutrality. Nothing is good or bad or should or shouldn't or right or wrong. It's just all a learning experience. It's all a time to reflect and understand yourself, which inherently I think is a huge part of the purpose of life. It's, discovering who you are without all these labels that society has placed on us, but also that we've been conditioned to place on ourselves.
What do you think had the biggest impact on your recovery? Like, was it something you heard? Was it realizations? Was it therapy? Like, what enabled you to recover?
The first thing that comes to mind is on my, like, what I call my rock bottom moment, and this was in May of 2017, and I was having a panic attack because I was having panic attacks every single day for about 6 months. But just, my mom not knowing how many almonds I had to put on my oatmeal, because I would always test her, like, how much do I eat? What does my meal plan say? And she would have all these little note cards. And one time she messed up, and I caught her on that. And I remember this specific instance, she had dinner 3 minutes late. and I had a full-blown panic attack. And my sisters, were used to it at this point. But every time, it was terrifying because every time I would hit my mom, I would give her bruises. One time I smashed a teapot into the wall that she had spent hours painting. And it was at that moment after I'd smashed this teapot and I saw my sisters sitting in the corner, trembling, just their eyes filled with terror. And I think that was the first time that I could so clearly see this isn't just about me anymore. This is affecting everyone I love. And I remember saying these words. I was sitting on my bed, crying in tears, and I said, I just can't do this anymore. That was the real big turning point in that I knew this whole recovery thing was not going to be easy. I knew it was going to be suffering and it was going to be hard and I was going to want to quit and turn back. But at that moment, it was that famous quote of, it's only up from here. I could not go any deeper than that. And I think because I always remembered that moment of how desperate and lost I felt, that was a huge motivator for me in recovery. It was like, there has to be something better than this because I just can't do this anymore. And I feel like all of us have to reach some sort of real realization moment at some point, like a turning point almost. And that's kind of where my mind is going now, is that word decide, how it means in Latin or Greek, to cut off. To decide to recover meant for me I had to cut myself off from this like previous identity so that I could make a new one. Because I think ultimately that is again a huge element of recovery, is recognizing that you do not always have to be the same identity for the rest of your life. Of course, we have the same body and the same cells. Well, not the same cells because we're constantly dividing, but like the DNA, we can't change that. But we always get to change our identity, who we are, how we think, our habits. And yeah, I'm kind of going in a rabbit hole here, but that rock bottom moment, that was like the moment for me that I felt really was the turning point for me.
I actually like the identity topic, but I just want to, and forgive me this question if it sounds ignorant, but I'm trying to understand, like,
Steph, you are not ignorant, so
well, we're all something.
Oh, you don't
sometimes.
hear all the stuff we cut out. It's terrible
Well, I think
sometimes.
that word ignorant is just so negative. I think it's more like, excuse me if I seem incompetent, but I think incompetence is so important because to learn anything new requires temporary incompetence. And I think it's so important to be humble. So I think more
Okay.
appropriate is like, excuse me if I'm humble. Well, okay. I will.
Ignorant is admittedly a label that I had been assigned. I will rephrase some of the things that when you're describing them, especially the part about making the abstract concrete
Mhm.
and even to some extent predictability and grounding in things that are otherwise very confusing and
Yeah.
overwhelming is also present for me and
Right.
you. And like it's
Right, of
this is
course.
such a common thing, especially I work with a lot of people with trauma and it intersects there a lot.
Yeah.
So how do you figure out the distinction between what parts of the eating disorder needed to be addressed, or maybe it's a spectrum of it,
Yes.
versus like where the autism needs to be respected? You know what I mean? And like,
Yes.
because I could imagine somebody listening might say, well, I need that too. Like I'm not neurodivergent, but I find safety in X, Y, and Z. And maybe thinking, well, maybe I don't have to get, because it does feel like it helps me to know those things. Is that always the case? And like, how did you figure out what to challenge and what to not?
Yeah, no, I love this question because you're so right, and I love that you brought up that word spectrum because I believe that eating disorders, I don't like to call them disorders. I like to call them adaptations, and I think the DSM would be a lot better off if we renamed eating disorders as a spectrum of adaptive eating behaviors. Because I think whether we're talking about restriction or quote unquote healthy eating or even binge eating, it's all an adaptation to feel safe and to trust and to have predictability or whatever our nervous system and body needs in circumstances where we feel we can't access that safety. We don't feel that safety. We don't feel that groundedness. So to answer your question about, how do you know if it is the autism or the eating disorder, I like to say it comes down to the word intention. Is it rooted in fear or is it rooted in love. And there's one quote here that comes to mind is, everything we do is either an act of love or it's a cry for love. And for me, and I think anyone, the eating disorder is always rooted in fear. Fear of, weight gain, fear of losing control is such a big one. But I think when it comes to autism and, respecting those traits, it's rooted in love. Because, for example, bringing back that menu example, the predictability, I guess you could spin it as like, I'm afraid of not knowing what's going to be there. But for me, it isn't about fear or being afraid. It's more about when I can respect that need that I need to know and have that predictability, I actually genuinely feel like my entire body filling up with love and like you're safe. You can be compassionate, you can respect yourself. And I feel like there's no ironically tangible, concrete way to answer this
Mm.
because I have a very strong gut instinct. Like this just feels right or this just feels wrong. And I have that a lot too when I write my books. I don't write them from my thoughts or from my head. I write them from my being. And I think for me now, even telling like what is the eating disorder, what is the autism, that a huge part of that process was actually giving myself permission to trust this innate wisdom. Because there was a point where I knew, if I was going to weigh my food at that moment or not. There was this moment that I knew, like, this is me just wanting to know, or this is me being afraid to eat more. That was like very distinct, not in my mind, it was in my body. So I know that's so abstract and vague, but that's really the best way I can describe it.
It's helped me think about because I talk about safety a lot, and I'm
Yeah.
as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about like, well, I could also understand that like I can think personally, like there were times where doing the safe thing felt like the most intuitive and like loving
Yeah.
thing,
Right.
but it wasn't. But I think the actual distinction might be, and this is just my brain literally like thinking about this right now,
Yeah.
is maybe there's a distinction between safety and love. Like, I guess what
Yes.
felt
I
safe
love
to
that.
me didn't necessarily feel like loving myself and of course that's a hard thing for me to even talk about. Like that's not
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
language, but I'll use it. Like there's a difference in that when you're talking about that intuitive sense. I know what that is now. And like this being part
Yeah.
feels like love for myself. It feels like me being the most in touch with myself from a
Yes.
very, I don't know the word for it, place, but it's a very authentic and
Compassionate.
warm. It's even bigger than that to me. It's like
It's
it's
bigger.
the
Okay.
self. It's like and also beyond the self. But the other things, the things that would have helped me, like knowing a calorie count, would have made me feel so safe and would have felt like the
Yes.
what I needed, and it would have felt like it protected me. But it's not coming from like love. It's coming from safety. And
That
so I think
need for
maybe this
control. Yeah.
distinction, yeah, like there's something different. There's a nuance there that I think maybe helps me understand the difference here.
Yeah. I love that you bring it up. I definitely think you are right about that. There being a distinction, and I think words fail us in this aspect because even safety versus love, there's no words to describe this. It's just an innate feeling, and I'm so aware of, if I was listening to this and if I was struggling, I'd be like, "Come on, Steph and Livia and Sarah, like use your words here." But there really aren't, and I know what you mean when you say the safety in terms of the eating disorder, because there were a lot of things I did in my eating disorder, like the obsessive running, even though I was exhausted. I told myself, I convinced myself, and this was a deep-rooted belief that I had, was, I can only like not feel anxious if I go on my run right now. And that made me feel safe, but again, it was not coming from a place of respect and compassion for myself. It was not loving my body because I knew at every step, like I could drop dead any moment, but like none of that mattered because that illusory sense of I have control mattered more to me in that moment, or I thought it mattered more to me in that moment. So yeah, we'll definitely both have to think on this, and I'd love to share our processing someday. But I definitely think there is a distinction between love and safety. But I think when it comes again back to how do you distinguish the eating disorder behavior from the autistic trait, is in a sense that innate feeling of like, how does this feel in your body? Like, is it giving you this feeling of oh, this feels like loving and good and grounded? Or does it feel like this feels grounding and safe, but there's also a part of me that's like, I don't know if you should do that. Because I think when you start to recognize and bring that awareness to who is me versus the eating disorder, and you ask yourself this question of like, which one is me? When it's coming from the eating disorder, there's always going to be a little like pushback of your being, of your soul almost, of like, this isn't good for you. But we override that and we override that and we override that. And that's how an eating disorder becomes ingrained.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about extreme hunger? Because I know
Mm-hmm.
you've just written a whole book about it.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about extreme hunger, is your experience of it that this was something you experienced after you decided to recover? Had you been
Yes.
very controlled and clung on to the control from there? Or did you ever have periods of extreme hunger breaking through where you lost control whilst you were still like very actively in your eating disorder?
No, I actually, the first time I experienced extreme hunger was when I was quote unquote weight restored. And that's why I think it terrified me most. And I think biologically, we are aware of this phenomenon, when the body starts moving into safety, coming out of that energy deficit, understanding, primally, I'm not in a famine, I'm not in danger. I have permission to be hungry and to want food. And because I was literally told by the doctor, like, you at a healthy weight, you can stop gaining weight now. When the extreme hunger came, I was like, oh, no, no, no. Like, I am broken. My body is wrong. I had a huge fear that I was developing binge eating disorder. And I was like, there's something wrong with me. So I actually tried to like go back to the restriction and I tried to restrict. But a realization that I faced over and over again was that my body had now adapted to such an extent that I literally, even if I wanted to, I could never go back to my eating disorder in this restriction sense because every time I tried, to do the intermittent fasting and then only eating healthy, it would always be met with a quote unquote binge slash extreme hunger episode slash feast. And I kind of went back and forth with,
Can I just ask there,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, just in case there's anyone listening who is experiencing extreme hunger but doesn't know it,
Mm-hmm.
what was that? Can you describe what that was like? What was going on for you? How it felt? What was happening?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time it's described as like a bottomless pit hunger, like your stomach is a black hole that can't be filled. For me, I've never really had like physical hunger cues in the sense that my stomach rumbles. Like if my stomach is rumbling, I probably have not eaten for like 3 days. Um, but for me, when I'm hungry, it's like I feel a magnetic pull towards food. Like, and I will think about food, but it isn't even the mental aspect as much as it is just like this, my being feels like attracted to food. And I felt that when I was going through extreme hunger, I was constantly like magnetized. I don't even know if that's a word, but like food was constantly attracting me and I couldn't do or think or just really engage with any other activities besides food. And during my eating disorder, this was looking up food photos, like scrolling through Instagram, taking pictures of food, making recipes and not eating it and giving it to other people. But when I was going through extreme hunger, my entire life like revolved around eating. And it was especially eating all the foods that I had deemed junk food, quote unquote junk food and off limits for all these years. I would, with such desperation, I would go to the grocery store, fill my basket with cakes and pies and pints of ice cream and jars of Nutella. And I just remember so clearly walking around with my basket and thinking like I'm sure other people weren't even paying attention, but I was just thinking, oh, they probably think I'm like buying this for the family. And I was like, little do you know, I'm about to like go home with such urgency. Like I could not get home fast enough to gorge everything as fast as I could. And I wouldn't even taste half of what I was eating because my body was just like, we need all the calories we can get. And it was even more of a food obsession than it almost was during the eating disorder because now I would think about it. And the moment I would think about, that apple pie, like I needed that apple pie. Like there was no way out of it. And I'm very aware that based on listening to your podcast, people who binge eat, who maybe don't have like a very severe history of restriction, I'm very aware that's probably exactly what a binge urge feels like. So I'm curious what your response is to everything I just said from your perspectives.
Mine, it's had so many different flavors to it. It
Yeah.
sounds like that very intense one you're talking about was how mine started right at the
Hmm.
beginning. And I had not restricted much. I'd
Well,
restricted a
for two
tiny bit.
weeks, right? When you
Yeah,
went on
through
vacation.
2.5, 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And then that was it. And then it was 9 months of exactly that.
Yeah.
And then it would go through kind of peaks and troughs and come and go. And then but I'm because what happened with me, and it sounds like what you've alluded to as well, you're saying you tried to go back to restriction. So this
Yes.
extreme hunger is happening and you're resisting and you're
Yes.
pushing back. And as the case for most people, when we start getting in a battle with our appetite, that
Yes.
just makes it worse and worse.
What
So
you
I'm
resist persists. Yep.
yeah, I'm curious how that settled down. Was it a case of you started to understand and you accepted it? Did it just recede? How did you get out of it?
Well, to get out of it, the first step was the acceptance. I remember journaling and writing, I don't know if I'm going to, well, I knew I was going to gain weight, eating like 20,000 calories plus a day. I was like, I know I'm going to gain weight. And if I keep fighting this, it's going to keep controlling me. I don't know how much weight I'm going to gain. I don't know where I'm going to end up, but this is no way to continue on because I can't fight my body because the body just can't be fought. And that for me was a very important moment because that's when I said, I surrender to the hunger. I surrender to my body and what it needs.
Did you trust it would pass then?
I did. I
Hmm.
did. Well, there was also a part of me that was like, I trusted it would pass. At the same time, I was like, how do I know it will pass? But it was
That's
like,
unpredictable, right?
exactly. So that was hard. But at that point, there was nothing I could do because I knew that if I quote unquote tried to restrict, I knew that wasn't working because that was going on for months and months and months. And that just made the food obsession worse. And I was like, I can't, it's like that Einstein quote, you can't solve a problem by trying to approach it in the same way over and over again. And I was like, I know that trying to restrict is not helping. So I can go the alternative path. And yeah, there's no predictability here, but is there predictability the other path either? Like both cases are gonna be hard and suck. But it's, I know that this one that I'm currently doing, the restriction, binging, that's not working. So I had really no choice but to do the other one. And eventually, once I gave myself full permission to eat the jars of Nutella, to eat the entire pie, there came a point where I was like, I really do not want to eat an entire pie. Like the idea of eating that much food that quickly, like actually started to like not disgust me, but I would feel such resistance to doing that. There was also, I think, this piece of like, if I mentally would say I'm not allowed to have this, it would almost make me eat it faster and eat more because it was like, you're not allowed to have this. You can't tell me what to do. And then I would just eat more. And I think when you give that self permission, you start to realize, like, well, now that I gave myself permission, I don't even want that thing anymore because I'm allowed to have it. So that just kind of kept occurring more and more as it just like slowly died down. And then the hardest days were, I think, were the ones in which it would die down, and then suddenly there would be this one day where it would happen all over again, and that was really frustrating for me. And that's kind of when I would convince myself, see, I knew it, you're developing binge eating disorder. But then it would again worsen it because I was judging it rather than respecting it. So that was really a journey that lasted, I'd say, a few years, honestly. But I think it's all part of it.
I mean, I don't want to be
Helped you.
redundant because I feel like everyone's heard my story, but I resonate very strongly with the extreme hunger. And actually, I'm sitting here thinking, like, in some ways, having that extreme hunger, and by the way, you don't have to be anorexic to have that
Totally.
because I was absolutely experiencing that. And I was, even when I was binging every day, because I would then restrict.
Yeah.
I think that the body codes, at least I think my body coded my original anorexia early as no,
Mm,
anything that even looks a little bit like this in the future, we are reacting as if it's happening like this
yes.
again. And I think
Oh,
that's
same.
why I felt it so strongly, even from just small hours of restriction. Like my body would go into extreme hunger. Um, and the way you describe it is exactly how it felt. but it's interesting because in recovery, it was almost like having an experience of extreme hunger. There's a contrast against what I think of as a different kind of binge urge, maybe a more permitter binge urge, where it's like there's still an urge, but it's not that kind. And it's more of like a numbing kind. And that helped me because I was like, oh, this kind of urge to food is different than this one. And even that distinction was helpful for me to be like, this is where other things make sense that don't make sense when I'm in extreme hunger. And differentiating that was helpful to me to be able to understand what was happening. And it still remains helpful to me, like working with people. Because sometimes I think with this extreme kind, that's where like the permission piece is like, yeah, like, because that's the body's just like,
feels right.
Yep.
Yeah.
But the other kind, then it gets shadier, like later after that, because then it can becoming disconnected from self or numbing oneself, and like the emotional components come in, or habits and dopamine, like that's a different landscape. And the eat all foods, just let yourself eat, doesn't help as much there as it does with the extreme hunger. So I think that's why we have different people talking about it in different ways, because I think we've all experienced binge eating differently.
Yeah, and something that's coming up for me right now is part of the reason why, like, innately I kind of knew that it wasn't binge eating disorder that I was developing was like every time, after I had just eaten so much food, and I would just be astounded how it would all even fit into my body, which I'm sure you resonate with. Like, I was like, how is this all in me right now? But there was never like the shame attached to it that I know is so prominent among people who binge eat, like the shame and the guilt afterwards. I think I mentally, cognitively had that, but my body was like, no, you needed that. Like, and I would be so nauseous and full, and I could be unable to move because I had eaten so much. But I felt like, I'm safe, I'm grounded. And when I started to really notice that, and I think give myself permission to let that be there, that's how I knew it was my body needing this. It was my nervous system needing that to feel safe and to get out of this fight or flight mode that I had been in for really my entire life.
I'm really excited for you because I think by the time this episode comes out, your latest book, Extreme Hunger, will be available for people to buy. So we will pop links to that. I'm assuming that you're selling via Amazon, are you?
Yeah, and also direct via my own website, LivLabelFreeBooks.com.
Okay.
I'll send you all the links. Yeah.
Yeah. Because and I at the risk of sounding like a patronizing 42-year-old, you're 24 and you've written what, three books? 4 books?
Well, technically 6, but by the time this comes out, 3 are gonna have been published.
Yeah. Which is just incredible. You are like a voracious content creator, just putting your message out there. So kind of thank you for being that resource for people that I also see too.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, you and Steph, well, Steph and you, both of you have been incredible parts of my journey. I actually discovered the Life After Diet podcast when I was going through extreme hunger. And the way in which you both are able to describe situations with such nuance, I think that is such a gift, because I think ironically so much of this anti-diet culture eating disorder recovery space is so black and white. You both so beautifully explain how, yes, this is applicable, but not always. And then explaining and diving into the not always piece. And that's not easy. That's hard. And I think that's why a lot of people don't want to go there. But that's where the true meaning comes in. That's where you truly connect with the people who feel like, why am I not fitting either black or white? Why am I in this void? And you guys are willing to go into the void. And that's where, any kind of growth and transformation happens.
Well, thank you, Liv. I think you're doing that too. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.